go down that path. Joining me live now is Liberal Senator for Victoria, James Paterson. Thanks for your time. I know we've spoken a lot before around lockdowns. Thankfully, your city, your state right now, not in that predicament. But what do you make of this? Is New South Wales still this gold standard, or does this prove that COVID is really hard to deal with?
Tom, it certainly feels like a bit of a role reversal for Victorians here who are not under strong restrictions. There's some mask mandates and other things, but not those sorts of strong restrictions. And now seeing New South Wales and some other parts of Australia go into those sorts of restrictions. I think Gladys Berejiklian's leadership throughout the crisis has been outstanding, and she's rightly been reluctant to go into lockdown because of the enormous cost and consequences for society and the economy, the profound impact it has on small business, on young people, on their education. We shouldn't rush into lockdowns, but that doesn't mean that lockdown is never appropriate, that there's no circumstances under which we should lock down. And I think if New South Wales residents think about the last 18 months under her leadership, they'll be grateful that the only time they have gone into lockdown is when it was really medically and scientifically necessary.
I suppose we'll only know in the next couple of weeks the sort of timing and when they got it. But what about AstraZeneca and the vaccine? Because we are more vulnerable with a lower vaccine rate. We know the AstraZeneca advice came out from ATAGI. Do we need to think more about these potential outbreaks, the lockdowns, the impacts you spoke about there, and even potential death, when we're looking at who gets this vaccine? Because right now, a lot of people under the age of 60, I'm sure, would be open to getting this, and they would have been very open to getting it 2 or 3 months ago.
Tom, as you know, I'm the Deputy Chair of the COVID-19 Senate Select Committee, and last week ATAGI, the Chief Health Officer, the TGA and others appeared before the committee to explain to us the decision that ATAGI made, the recommendation ATAGI made, that only over 60s should now receive the AstraZeneca vaccine. And the questions I put to one of the co-chairs from ATAGI was, would the decision have been any different to raise that recommended age had there been a significant COVID outbreak in Australia, had there been significant community transmission? And he said, of course, that they would have to take that into account, and that one of the reasons they were able to make that recommendation is the relatively low transmission of COVID in Australia. Now, unfortunately, the risk of raising the age and discouraging or delaying some people getting the vaccine means that there is some time lost. There's a time lag, as I saw you point out in your interview with the chief nurse before, and there may well be some people who would regret not having had the opportunity to have a vaccine because that age rate has been lifted. So I hope ATAGI continues to look at this, particularly given the very, very low risk of harm or death from the vaccine. Of the 4 million doses of AZ administered in Australia, there have been 2 deaths. So you have a 1 in 2 million chance of dying from getting the vaccine. That's far, far, far lower than the rate of death you would face if you got COVID.
And what's that urging for ATAGI? Is there any issue that ATAGI essentially just hands down decisions to the government? You know, should there be a menu of options then given to the government? Because it talks about what it factors in, but again, to what you two are alluding to there, you can't suddenly vaccinate, and perhaps we're too captive to the present day. When there's no COVID, you think, well, we couldn't possibly recommend something that kills 2 people out of 4 million, but you should always factor in the possibility of outbreaks. It's happening out now, it'll happen again.
Tom, throughout this crisis, the government has listened very closely and always followed the expert medical advice, and the record shows that that has been good for Australia. We have been largely protected from death as a result of COVID, unlike many other countries around the world, and our economy is in amazingly good shape when you compare it to almost all of our peers around the world. To have an unemployment rate of 5.1% after the year or so we've had is just remarkable. But I've also have the view that we should always balance the medical advice against all other considerations on the economy, on health, on society, on civil liberties, on all those fundamental things. And it's a task of politicians to listen carefully and seek that medical advice, but ultimately to be accountable ourselves for the decisions we make.
Right, so to that point then, at the moment we just get a decision from ATAGI. Should there be a suite of options from ATAGI, the government then selects one?
Well, I don't want to dictate to ATAGI how they provide their advice. They should do that at arm's length from government, and they should do that balancing all of those important considerations, as I'm sure they do, and as it appeared that they do from the questions that I asked and the answers that they gave before the Senate committee. It is a balancing consideration. There are trade-offs. We do have to balance the risk of a new outbreak and what the impact of that would be on unvaccinated people.
All right, just wanted to ask you finally as well, we've heard again and again from the government the vital role resources has played in keeping the economy going during COVID. We know huge money coming in from iron ore and coal exports as well. And yet now resources has gone out of cabinet. It seems a bizarre decision. Did it take you by surprise?
Oh, Tom, to be honest, I hadn't put much thought into who's in cabinet, who's out of cabinet. These are decisions made on the recommendation of the Deputy Prime Minister, Barnaby Joyce, about the allocation of portfolios among National Party MPs, as he's entitled to do under the coalition agreement. I don't think much tangible changes as a result of this, maybe a perception of change or a status of change, but Keith Pitt is still going to be the Minister of Resources. I'm sure he'll do just as good a job as he previously had done. Whether he attends cabinet meetings or not won't change the work he does in the portfolio.
But I mean, we were told, for example, when Veterans Affairs went into cabinet, this was vital, would elevate the role. By extension, this must bring down the role of resources. I mean, you'd be attacking Labor if they did this, wouldn't you?
Well, I'd ask you, Tom, what you think the practical implications are. How will policy change? How will operating a mine in Australia exporting resources be any different because Keith Pitt doesn't attend cabinet meetings anymore, at least
so does it not matter if
anything's
in or out of
He may well be invited. Well, I mean, obviously, you could take that to a logical extreme that would be absurd, Tom, and I'm not proposing to do that. But I'm also saying we shouldn't overanalyse this issue. I don't think most Australians are sitting around going, damn, a politician is no longer attending a committee meeting that he was previously attending. I don't think it's stopping their barbecues.
Well, they might not, but I'm just, that extension I took it to, isn't that logical? If it doesn't matter if resources is in or out of cabinet, why does it matter if anything is?
Well, Tom, obviously there has to be some members of the team around the cabinet table, and the role of cabinet is to make collective decisions on behalf of government and robustly test propositions that are brought forward by individual ministers. I'm sure if Keith Pitt has relevant policy to bring to cabinet, he'll be brought into cabinet for that purpose to present to it as is appropriate. And the other members of cabinet will, as they always do, test those propositions and come to an agreement. The normal functioning of government will go on. Don't lose too much sleep, Tom.
I'll try not to. James Paterson, thanks for your time.